with Associate Professors Nicholas Sawicki and Michael Kramp. Before I begin, I do want to mention with profound sadness the passing of our dear friend Ricardo Vieira. Ricardo served as the director and chief curator for the art galleries from 1974 to 2018, nearly 45 years. At LUAG, Ricardo established a visual laboratory and teaching collection program. He grew the university's collection from 2,500 objects into a world-class collection of over 15,000 works of art. We're approaching almost 17,000 today. And he also included a nationally recognized collection of Latino and Latin American works on paper, photography, and video. I'm extremely lucky to have had Ricardo as my professor and as a mentor to me throughout my career. He changed my life for the better by introducing me to the museum and community arts world, for which I am here today. I am one of many arts administrators and artists that Ricardo supported and provided guidance to and mentorship to. His passion for the arts was contagious, and he had an incredible way of making everyone he encountered feel special. He will be greatly missed. Ricardo's family is publishing an obituary in the Miami Press and other publications this week. Lehigh is in close contact with them and also working on communications to the Lehigh Valley community. The times we find ourselves make it challenging, for sure, to properly mourn the loss of such an important individual. But we will come together as a community and find an appropriate way to honor and memorialize Ricardo and his legacy in the coming days. If you have any photos or memories of Ricardo that you'd like to share with us, please send them to us at luag@lehigh.edu. In carrying on Ricardo's passion to provide transformative and educational experiences through art, the Art Galleries launched a new lecture series this fall called Art in Dialogue. This series is an opportunity to bring together artists and experts from a variety of fields to demonstrate and really show the impact and influence the visual arts have on other fields of inquiry, as well as how those fields influence art. Today, we will present the stories that pictures tell with Lehigh Associate Professors Nicholas Sawicki and Michael Kramp. Nicholas Sawicki is an art historian teaching and publishing on the history of modern art, and his principal area of research is early 20th century art in Europe. He's a specialist in modern Czech art and has written extensively on the subject. He's also published books and has been a past recipient of a Distinguished Scholar Fellowship at the Leonard A. Lauder Research Center for Modern Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He's gotten a Fulbright Fellowship and grants from other Getty Research Institute, Leo Baeck Institute, and Social Sciences Research Council. He received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and BA from New York University. Michael Kramp is an associate professor of English and the current director of the Film Studies minor. He specializes in 19th century British literature and critical theory. His scholarly interests include the novel, gender studies, and the visual culture. His classes frequently consider the role of literary and cultural texts in establishing and reinforcing social transformations of sexuality, national citizenry, and beauty. Michael received his PhD from Washington State University, where he held the Charles Blackburn Fellowship. Prior to coming to Lehigh, he taught at the University of Northern Colorado and Lafayette College. We are so lucky to have these two with us today to talk about the stories that pictures tell. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nicholas Sawicki.
Thank you, Stacy. Thank you very much. And for all of us who worked with Ricardo over the years, this has been a really challenging last week. Of course, given everything else that's going on in the world, to see his passing has been a difficult thing to process. And I want to thank everyone who's logged on tonight to take part in our conversation. I want to especially thank Michael Kramp, my friend and colleague from the English department, for joining us. Michael and I have, through the years, talking across the disciplines of art history and English, we've talked a lot about how images work and how they tell stories. And so I'm really pleased and grateful that he's joining us today so that we can have a conversation about this very topic. So tonight's conversation really reflects on the Lehigh University Art Gallery's current but now closed exhibition of the faculty of the Department of Art, Architecture, and Design. And my contribution to that exhibition is essentially a curatorial one. I wanted to bring out works from the gallery's collection and to give viewers at the exhibition an opportunity to connect with them. So this conversation reflects on that particular project. You're seeing it there now on your screen in one of the installation shots. As I was thinking about bringing works out of the gallery's very rich collection and installing it, I was thinking in particular about how a particular subset of viewers would connect with these images. I was thinking a lot about my students, and in particular, the students in the large introductory art history survey class that I teach usually once a year and that I'm teaching this semester. It's a really big class, over 100 or so students. And we don't, as a result, get a chance to go together and look at pictures in person. We see them in facsimile on the screen in the classroom. And so one of the things I insist on in that class is having students individually go out and look at artworks in person, one by one. I usually structure that as part of an assignment. And when I was thinking about my own contribution to the exhibition, I was thinking about how my students might use or interact with this installation in the assignments and the projects that I give to them. And I actually did send them out to the gallery to look very closely at and write about one of these two images that you're seeing here on the screen. So for the exhibition, I selected two artworks and paired them together in the installation. The first of them is a woodcut by the German Renaissance artist Albrecht Dürer, usually titled Joachim and the Angel. And the second one, and you couldn't see it fully in the installation shot, the second one is a photograph. And I want to signal here that this is an image that some of us might find troubling. It's an image of the wake of an Army staff sergeant who was killed in the Iraq War in 2004, a picture of grief and sorrow. I selected these two images. I placed them next to one another in the installation, as you saw in those photographs of the installation, because I was curious about what this juxtaposition might bring out in both of the pictures. And I wanted to see whether this encounter between the two images might elicit in the viewer a different kind of encounter, might get the viewer to look more closely at each of these pictures than if they had been hung separately or individually. So that was some of my thinking. So what I want to do just now for a minute or two before Michael and I start talking is I just want to give you a very basic both visual description and a historical description of what it is that you're seeing on your screen. And Stacy, if we could turn to the Dürer image, there we go. So the Dürer print comes from a bound series of woodcuts and texts that narrate the life of the Virgin Mary, and which Dürer published in 1511. This particular image depicts the story of Mary's parents, Joachim and Anne, who were unable to conceive a child. And to show penance and piety towards God, Joachim went into the wilderness to pray and to fast for 40 days. And in that time, an angel appeared to him and told him that his wife, Anne, would soon bear a child. That child would become the Virgin Mary. And back at their home, an angel also came to Anne to give her this same very joyous news. Dürer, in his picture, focuses on Joachim's encounter, and it centers on his sort of stunned encounter or conversation with the angel who's coming in from the left side of the print. If you look closely at the image, you'll also notice that there are several shepherds around the figure of Joachim who are witnessing the scene. You'll notice also that the setting is heavily forested, but that in the distance beyond, we can see a port and a small city, maybe somewhere in Galilee. This story itself comes from the apocryphal Gospel of St. James, probably first recorded in the 2nd century CE. And it was a popularly known and well-circulated story in the Renaissance when Dürer was working. If we could turn to the photograph now by Turnley. Turnley took this image in May of 2004 as part of a larger photojournalistic essay on the Iraq War. and it shows us the funeral rites of Army Staff Sergeant Esau Patterson Jr. in Ridgeland, South Carolina. Patterson was killed by a roadside bomb while on active duty in Iraq. And in the photograph, his casket anchors the left side of the image. And to the right side of the photograph is his mother, Carrie Mae Osgood Patterson, who stands there with her arms raised and her arms held wide. And there's tremendous emotion on her face. Her mouth is open as if she were speaking while this photograph was being taken. Behind the casket stands a member of the military honor guard. The essay in which the image was published was called The Bereaved, and it appeared in Harper's Magazine in August of 2004. The photograph was taken in May of that same year. And in the photographic essay, the caption below the picture simply reads, "A relative at the wake of Staff Sergeant Patterson." So that's what we know about that picture. So as I was saying, the idea that I had in bringing these two pictures together was to really see what kinds of conversations the two images would create among one another and among viewers. I was thinking again about how sometimes when you put two works side by side, we pay more attention to them generally than we would if we were seeing them one by one. I was also thinking a lot about how pictures tell stories generally, and how artworks and pictures in different media tell stories differently. I was thinking also about how our own subject position as viewers, our location in space and time, right? How that shapes how we interpret and come to understand the image. And there's sort of an old trope that I had in my mind when I was putting these two images together, the idea that the closer we are in time and space to an image, the more we understand it, right? And the further we are away from it, the less we understand it. And probably in broad strokes, that idea is at least nominally true, but I've never been entirely comfortable with that assertion. And something about these two pictures brought that tension to life for me. I was also really, I have to say, I was really just drawn to the images too, because of how they led us into what are essentially private moments, right? They make public and they visualize moments that are really private and highly individual, right? The moment of prayer for Joachim and the moment of grief and sorrow for Sergeant Patterson's mother, right? And I was thinking a lot about how images do that sometimes. And so these are some of the things that Michael and I will be talking about today. And these are some of the things that I wanted to accomplish by pairing the two pictures.
So I'm going to jump in here, I guess, if that's okay, and just offer my thanks for being invited to be part of this. I think this is a fantastic event, fantastic opportunity. And so I really want to thank Nick and thank William and Stacy and Alex for making this happen. I guess, Nick, if it's okay, just to sort of ask you to respond to, of all things, a couple of stories. I guess sort of before we get to the images, as we've been talking about these images over the last couple of months, I keep thinking about a couple of stories, and just maybe I'll sort of tell them and ask you to respond to them. One is, I was at the National Humanities Alliance Day last year in Washington, D.C., and there was an art historian from a small school in Louisiana who was there, who came and was talking about how we live in a visual culture that has never been more visual than it is today. Visual aspects, visual signs everywhere, always around us. And we've never had less visual training than we have today. We've never been in a situation where our education has been less emphasizing visuality than it is today. And I found that really profound as listening to you talk tonight about the images and your rationale and thinking about pairing them. I keep thinking back to that moment. I also keep thinking back to my, sort of early moments of going to museums. And, I love museums. I still love museums. But early on going to museums, I guess even to this day, almost an anxiety of going to museums, fearing that I'm not understanding things, that I'm not getting the meaning, that I'm not, that there's something that's escaping me, that there's a hidden riddle or a secret that I haven't unlocked. And I'm wondering, what the difference is. You have particularly chosen this title of the stories that these pictures tell. And I'd be interested in hearing you talk about, the difference between some sort of hermeneutic or puzzle or riddle or meaning that's in a picture, as opposed to the stories that these pictures are telling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are such they're such interesting and vibrant questions, Michael, right? The question about visual training or our contemporary lack of visual training, and then also the dilemma that so many viewers find themselves in museums and galleries of thinking, right, that we don't understand something. I guess I would start with the latter, and we still carry on with this assumption that the meaning of a picture is embedded in that image by the artist, right? And that it is singular and fixed. But of course, when we stand in front of a picture and we look at it and we look at it closely, we are ourselves shaping that meaning, right? We're constructing it and shaping it ourselves. So that's sort of an embedded myth of artistic practice and how we maybe generically think about art making, right? That the artist creates the meaning, but we create the meaning. The closer we look and the more time we spend with the picture, the more we engage with it, and we develop a sense of meaning that is personal to us as the viewer. And so that's an important thing, I guess, to emphasize, and which we try to emphasize in the classroom and when we're bringing students in to museums and gallery spaces, right? That the picture is not a puzzle or a riddle that was constructed to confound the viewer, or a riddle that was private only to the artist or known only to the artist. It's something that is and should be accessible to all and should be open or open-ended in its meaning. And maybe some of the blame rests on modernist pictures and abstract art and that kind of moment in the, let's say, 1920s to the 1940s, when art itself became less representational and museum goers really struggled with questions of like, how do I construct meaning by looking at an abstract picture? Maybe that's part of where that begins. And I always like to remember that museums and galleries were extraordinarily bustling, chatty places up until the early 20th century, right? So this dilemma that we sometimes face is maybe a more contemporary one. And as for visual training, I mean, we should all be trying in our own institutions, both in higher ed and especially in elementary and high school education, to give students access to visual training. But I think there's also kind of some mystery around visual training, or we sometimes think of that too as being very difficult to access, visual training or art historical training. And when I think of visual training, I think of my first year students in those introductory surveys who have had very little art historical training, if any, and who I'm sending out to the Lehigh University art galleries in the second or third week of class to go look at pictures individually, one-on-one, right, themselves. And they don't have much of a toolkit. They are simply asked to spend a substantive amount of time with the picture and to look closely, right? And I think visual training begins with that, giving ourselves time to look and looking closely, looking carefully, looking closely. And that's where I think visual training begins, or where it should begin.
Yeah, and I love the way you talk about looking closely, as though that takes time, it takes patience, and it seems to me it also takes a willingness. And this is going to sound awful, and I'm willing to sound awful. it seems to me it also takes a willingness to make up story, to narrativize a bit. That maybe we don't know the meaning, maybe we don't have the answers, but we can create story. And pictures, as I think you're demonstrating here tonight, Nick, pictures are such a valuable mechanism, such a powerful mechanism for doing that. I think both of these images are really, profound, or offer, I should say, profound windows, entryways into telling story. Let me just sort of throw something out, and then you can, dismiss as you see fit, or comment as you see fit. One of the things that I've, for months now, I've been thinking about with these images is how, you mentioned how they are sort of private moments that are made public, right? And I think that's really compelling. And I keep thinking about that in terms of this concept of some sort of ritual. Both of these moments, it seems to me, are sort of ritualistic encounters, where they are designed to commemorate, to celebrate, to recount, perhaps, some kind of ritualistic moment, some kind of ritualistic event. But we're not necessarily meant to be part of that, right? I mean, and yet we are, as you point out. And I'm wondering how that invites us to think about the kinds of stories they tell.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I mean, you and I have spent some time talking about how funerals are themselves ritual practices, right? And I think a lot about that in connection with the Turnley image. I imagine many of us have this experience somewhere in our history or in our past where we're attending the funeral of maybe not someone who was extraordinarily close to us, but someone who we thought we knew, right? And the ritual of the funeral rite reinforces that idea, right, of a kind of shared knowing within that community. And then someone comes up and talks about the deceased, and we realize at once that we don't know them at all, or that we knew them a lot less than we thought we knew them. We realize in those moments too that we don't understand and can't really easily empathize with the grief or the emotions of those who are left behind. And I think that particular rite, that particular ritual brings forth that tension that you're talking about, right? And I guess some of the tension that interested me too, right? What does it mean to present something in a very public, ritualized fashion that is essentially, has a very private, individualized component to it. So yeah, I mean, can I sort of throw the question back at you, or have you maybe say a little bit more about your thoughts about rituals?
Well, and I think part of it, I mean, I would speak specifically about the Turnley image for a moment, in that, the other aspect of the ritual, it seems to me, I guess, is that it's supposed to commemorate something that we think we know. Like, like, in other words, that I think of ritual as something that, an event that a select group of people, as you're pointing out, like, we think we know this person, we also think we know the event, like, we think we know what a military funeral should look like,
right?
And one of the things I love about the Turnley image is that it disrupts that, and I'll point to, small features here, right? But, the American flag does not cover the casket fully, right? That's disruptive to me. Like, that's not how I think the ritual here should be.
Right.
That the random metal folding chair in the back of the image, that's disruptive to the ritual that I think it should be, right?
Yeah.
And we're not, the cheap carpet, right, on the ground, right? That's disruptive to the way in which I think this ritual should operate. And so there's an image here of a ritual that I recognize, and then I want it to operate in a certain way because I expect the ritual to operate in a certain way. And the story that the picture is telling is not, it's not continuing that ritual.
Yeah. In other words, there are sort of seams showing and fissures showing in the picture that maybe in some ways undermine that. I wonder how much of that is bound up to, Michael, in just our having such long access and such close access to what's going on here. Like we have this picture up in front of us, we can look at it for 10, 15 minutes. And I wonder whether that scrutiny that we can lavish on this photograph, right, whether that makes us more attentive to these seams or these places where things don't align, right, to that tension and discord, than if we are part of the ritual ourselves, right, standing somewhere back in the room or part of that community. I guess I wonder about the attentiveness that happens at actual rituals, and then the attentiveness that we bring to an image of that ritual, right?
Yeah, no doubt.
Maybe that's different. Maybe that operates differently. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, Nick, about what you don't see in these images? In other words, I think that, I'm interested in, your expertise as an art historian. You help us see a lot in the images. What is not in the images that maybe we expect to see, or that, that would fill out the story in other ways?
Mm-hmm. Well, every narrative, of course, right, whether it's a visual one or a literary one, is as much about, I mean, the telling of the story is always premised on a certain kind of omission, right, or a selectiveness about the story that omits certain things. On a physical level, obviously, in both of these photographs, the mourned and prayed for child is not physically visible. So we know that, for sure. In the Dürer, quite interestingly, and I've been doing some more reading about this, thanks to our conversations, Michael, this story in the Gospels of St. James also includes an Annunciation scene where Anne, Joachim's wife, is also visited by an angel. And Dürer, when he's constructing this bound series of woodcuts, does not include the image of Anne's Annunciation. Instead, he concentrates on her husband, Joachim, and how he is greeted or visited upon by an angel who brings him the news. So it's a rather sort of curious jump over Anne's story that omits her. The next scene in this portfolio is Joachim and Anne reuniting at the Golden Gate, and they are both now privy to the news. But we never see Anne's experience or encounter with the angel, her own experience of this new hoped for news. So there is that absence in the Dürer, right, as well. So a lot of things really not present. Yeah,
I'm really interested in that, especially in the Dürer image, to think about, first of all, we have this idea of an Annunciation. We immediately think about the Annunciation of the Virgin. This is not that. This is not that narrative, right? And so there's a sense in which, when we look at these images, right, we think we know these stories, right, and yet we don't, right? This is a different Annunciation. We look closer, and we don't even see the subject of the Annunciation in this image, right? We don't see the child, we don't see the mother. What we do see, and we see it, I guess, let me rephrase that. We see a lot, however. We see the angel, we see the father, and we see all this stuff, right, in the back of the Dürer image. In other words, Dürer, it seems to me, isn't like lacking for topics or images, right, or life or death to represent. He's representing a ton. He's he's consciously choosing, it seems to me, not to represent Anne, not to represent the child. Mm-hmm. Those seem to be, deliberate choices here on the part of
it's interesting. Well, and of course, in the context of the whole bound book of woodcuts, again, that he skips over Anne's story is quite interesting. Other Renaissance artists in producing images of the story of Joachim and Anne would picture them sequentially, or these encounters with the angel sequentially. So one could see both images. So it is interesting that Dürer skips over the story. And it is, I mean, it's a picture that's completely chock full of details, which is quite extraordinary when one remembers that we're dealing here with a woodcut. This is an image that is very rich with visual information, but not that particular information, right, that we're talking about. And I wonder, Michael, if now might be a time for us to talk a little bit about different media and how, in particular, how film-based media like photography and you, of course, as the scholar of film, have done a lot of thinking about this, how film-based media operates differently, maybe in the way that it narrates story, how film-based media is often taken by us to have a kind of evidentiary quality, right, to be documentary. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about that, right, the difference in media.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we often think about film-based media, and I would, I would certainly include work like Turnley's in that. I mean, and photography is sort of the origins of film-based media. Is often considered to provide documentation, to provide evidence of something. And so when we look at a Turnley, a photograph, this moment took place, this moment happened. Where Durer's piece is clearly a fabrication, right? It's a reproduction. It is not a representation. Where Turnley's image is a representation, and so it is deemed to give us that a representation of reality. It's also, however, has a sequence to it, which I think is really interesting, in that it's in other words, as a film-based medium, it is of a time past. It's a moment that is no longer with us, and so the evidence that it suggests, or its evidentiary quality, its documentary quality, is something that we no longer can cling to and say, like, it is evidentiary because it's an evidence, or it has evidentiary value of something that is gone by.
Yeah.
In the 19th century, this was something that early photography scholars discovered and were able to manipulate, and were able to do things like double exposure,
Right.
triple exposure, and to demonstrate the ways in which photography wasn't in its origin was not evidentiary. And I think Turnley is really, really good at this, and sort of tempts us to sort of, as viewers,
Yes.
to sort of think about this moment as something that was so pure and so sincere, as if it were a moment in time that is captured, as opposed to a moment in time that has been, and again, I'm going to use a term here that's going to sound crass, but as opposed to a moment in time that may have been manipulated. I think that sounds crass, but I think that there's something about this moment that is odd.
Yeah. It's sort of, as you're talking about that, I'm thinking about what you were saying earlier about how rituals and images allow us to suppose that we know, right? And I think maybe photography in some ways tempts us to think about the images and stories that way, right? Maybe because of this documentary tradition and this sort of age-old idea that photographs bear witness, that they represent a certain truth, right? So I think maybe we are tempted before a photograph to think that we really know, right?
Right. Yeah. Or that it can give us access to, it can give us pure access to a moment that's gone past.
Yeah.
Right?
Do you think that when, in your work, both studying film and documentary film, and also working with students on documentary films themselves, do you think that there's a particular responsibility that a filmmaker or a photographer brings to image making when confronting scenes of grief and sorrow? What Susan Sontag, in a book of this name called The Pain of Others, right? In that book of hers regarding the pain of others, is there a particular responsibility that the person behind the camera has towards this kind of subject matter, towards the people who are there, towards that community.
Yeah, and I think there's a responsibility we have to the viewers too, as well as to the subjects, right? To the subjects of that, and I think this has all been changed, of course, by the reproducibility of those mediums, right? Because they're so easily reproduced. I'll just tell a quick story because we're talking about stories. I'm going to tell a quick story. I was working with a student last night about a project he's working on how COVID-19 has changed the effect or the workings of the Lehigh Valley census effort here in Northampton and Lehigh counties. And he is doing this very sort of Michael Moore documentary film approach where he is sort of mixing in footage of the local news and national news with comments from President Trump about how insignificant COVID-19 is, how it will disappear, how it's nothing to worry about. And I was commenting to him about how it's really important that you provide dates and context to when President Trump makes these comments. And he was sort of pushing back on me saying like, why is that important? I want to make him sound like an idiot. And I suggested, well, you do whatever you want, but it's still important. Everyone deserves to be treated ethically. And everybody deserves that sort of, ethical representation. All the viewers deserve to sort of be able to make their own assessments and their own judgments. And I think that those become the kinds of, I would circle back here, Nick, to my experience in the museum of, I want to be able to negotiate art myself. Like I want to be able to negotiate those stories and delve into those stories. So I think it does become this, immense responsibility we have when we're dealing with images and the evidentiary power that we lend to them.
Yeah, as you're saying, both for the person who made the image and for the viewer, right?
Yeah.
For both parties. Well, great. Well, this is great. I think we're sort of at the time where we can jump towards, I think, Stacy, questions. Yeah.
So, participants, please, we would love to hear from you if you have questions for Professor Sawicki or Kramp. So there is a question here from Marie. While we can certainly connect these two images in some kind of way, the notion, as you said, of a private moment made public, what originally made you bring them together?
That's a great question. I could give a sort of elevated, obfuscating answer, or I could tell you how this kind of thing works, and I think I'm going to do the latter. And it's a great question, and one that when it's posed to folks who are doing curatorial work, I think it's a really great question. I started with the image by Dürer, which I knew from the collection. It's one of 2 Dürer prints in the Lehigh University collection. And I very much wanted my students in the class I'm teaching this semester to go and take a look at it. And I spent a lot of time thinking about what to pair the image with. I wanted it to have another work to sit side by side with it for the reasons I underlined at the beginning of today's session. And I spent a lot of time in the storage facilities of the gallery with the gallery staff, looking through works that I knew, works that I wasn't very familiar with. And I was looking for something that would resonate for me personally. That was the beginning. And I think, most curators and most people working in curatorial practice, if speaking candidly and honestly, will say that that's where it begins, right? That's how we begin to make choices. So already there, I'm telling you that there was a certain resonance for me in seeing these 2 works side by side. A very powerful one. I think a lot of it had to do with the gestures even of the hands, and the way that both Sergeant Patterson's mother and Joachim and the Dürer have their hands raised, but for different reasons. And that gesture brought the pictures together. And also that connection, that thematic connection of both desperately wanting to have a child and desperately mourning the loss of a child. That when I was looking through all of these works last fall, in order to put this installation together, that was just on, I don't know, it was on my mind. And I also thought that there was an urgency generally in having us look more closely at images that we normally see very frequently and dismiss, right? Military bodies in caskets, flag draped caskets. These are pictures that we see routinely in the press. These days, we're seeing other images of sorrow and of caskets in the present COVID crisis. I really thought that I wanted to somehow foreground that and have us look at those things a little bit more closely, right? Not assume that we understand, right? And I think that kind of drove the decision. So I hope that sheds some light on it, Marie-Sophie, and thank you for the question.
Nick, maybe I can ask one more question while the chat
Sure.
operates. And this is an unfair question because I thought of this just while you were talking at the start. So you don't know what's coming. But the wake of Esau Patterson, excuse me. The biblical reference to that of Jacob's brother Esau.
Yes.
I didn't notice that until just tonight. But
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting, right? That he's the sort of, forgotten son of Isaac, right?
Yeah, I had not been thinking about that at all, frankly, and it's really wonderful that you bring it out here. I had to do a fair amount of research on Patterson and his family simply to establish from the Harper's essay that Turnley published that we were in fact dealing with this particular person. The name of his mother, for example, is nowhere mentioned. I researched it in the local papers in Ridgeland, South Carolina, in the obituaries. It's interesting that the piece that Turnley published doesn't even really bring much emphasis to the name at all. It certainly doesn't underscore this, the biblical nature and origins of the name, but that's a connection I hadn't been thinking about at all. It certainly adds another layer of resonance to this pairing, doesn't it?
Yeah. I know that there's some more questions here for you. Stacy, do you want to take those?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so actually it's to both of you. Michael's comment about the omnipresence of visuality was striking. Nick alluded to the act of close reading and modernism. Can you both talk about how reading images from your cell phone is different from reading visual works in a museum, for example, which is a great question considering the times we find ourselves in.
Wow.
Nick, you are far more qualified to address this than I am, so please.
Boy, that's a great question, Matt. Like we're all of us scholars, students, all of us involved in the field of education are now huddled over small devices of various types, right? Squinting at each other, squinting at texts and squinting at images. Well, it's a very different kind of encounter. In most of our art history classes at the university, particularly the introductory ones, we make very clear at the beginning to students that although we're looking at facsimile images in the classroom, that act of looking is different from the act of looking in the museum setting, in the gallery space. Notably and quite obviously, there's a tremendous amount of loss of visual information as we move from looking at an artwork in person to looking at its facsimile on a screen. And you can even see this right now in the images that Stacy has up on the screen. That Dürer digitized, right, photographed and now displayed on your screen on whatever device you're looking at is not only tiny, but it literally lacks the visual information and the visual data that the original image has. So it's a very different experience. And you know, neither is somehow, you know, innately better than the other. They are different types of viewing, right? And all we need to emphasize, I think, when we're looking at these kinds of things and emphasize to our students is that we're looking at different types of images, right? And that those encounters are differently structured, and that we gather different information and we construct different meanings based on that, right? So it's a fantastic question and something that I think a lot of scholars also of the digital humanities are thinking about, right? The shift from the analog to the digital world, the loss of visual information, the way that the digital constructs a new experience, right? For, in this case, for the art object. Michael, how about you? What do you think about?
The first thing that I've been, you know, we, over the last, you know, things that we're doing in the COVID-19 experience, we bought a new record player here at my house, and we've been, you know, pulling out my old LP collections, and my older son has been enjoying, you know, sort of encountering some music that he hadn't encountered. I pulled out old Fleetwood Mac albums with Peter Green, the original Fleetwood Mac records when they were still a blues band with Peter Green on guitar, and he's discovered he really likes that. And I was telling him you know, how much music I learned going to old record stores and just flipping through records and reading things on the backside of records or opening them up. And one of the great things that happened there, right, is that it was a communal experience, that people would walk over to you and say, oh, you should go check this out, or let me tell you more about that. And it seems to me that something similar happens in museums and galleries, you know, is that you sort of eavesdrop, or people interrupt you and say, you know, let me tell you more about that. You know, I feel like I've learned more about art and visuality by wandering around the Tate, you know, and having people tell me things, and I don't know if they're true or not, you know, I don't care, you know, but they're really fascinating. And I think that when we're huddled over a cell phone, we lose that communal aspect.
Yeah,
it's an individual experience.
Yeah, I guess, you know, in connection with that, and that's fascinating, Michael, and we're of the same generation, so I too remember that same experience, right, of the record store, something that, you know, very few people or younger students now can really grasp. But you know, what I wanted to say and maybe just emphasize for context is that, interestingly enough, both this Dürer and this Turnley, these images were made not for communal experience in the same space, right, where people could chat and eavesdrop, as the way, you know, as you're describing it, but they were actually made to be held in the hand, right? The Turnley appeared in Harper's Magazine, so something that we read in small format individually. Maybe someone's reading over our shoulder, but probably not. And the Dürer was bound in a codex in a book, and was also meant to be looked at individually, and it's not particularly large either. So while these things are larger than our cell phone screen, and they're certainly much more information rich than a cell phone screen, them hanging in the museum or in the Lehigh University art galleries now is not where, you know, it is not the format for which the artists intended these things to be viewed, right? So the gallery space is kind of unusual for these two pictures because they were meant to be individually, privately, right, looked at. So just for context, you know, throwing that out there.
Well, on that same kind of vein of conversation, Sarita had a great question for you as well. And something that we really try to teach and impart within the Lehigh University galleries is how individuals can make meaning for themselves with encounters of works of art. So she wants to know, how do you both communicate this idea of the audience or students being the makers of meaning when encountering art? And how do you challenge the idea that art has some kind of hidden truth that has to be discovered or revealed to the audience?
Yeah. Michael, do you have some thoughts about that? We were talking about that a little bit earlier. It's a great question, Sarita. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm gonna be. I don't have a great thought on this. I think that the way that I try to do this, I think, you know, commonly is just by pointing to history. In other words, that to try to demonstrate that history, or through, you know, that individual pieces of art or, you know, photographs are a great example of this. photographs have meant different things at different times. That there has not been that the meaning of specific artworks, right, has not been stable, that it hasn't been static, that it has shifted from time period to time period. Film is a really good example of this, right? That certain films that we think about as, a classic example of this, right, is the birth of a Nation, right? Films that we think about as being classic and iconic pieces of American cinema become radically reinterpreted, throughout the years, right? So I like to think about that as a way of understanding the ways in which, that there's not one meaning to be uncovered, right? That they become, tools, right? That they become mechanisms of a culture to disseminate ideas.
Exactly, yeah. And emphasizing the way that meanings shift throughout history is a great way of making that visible for students. Sarita, what I try to do in a practical way in the classroom to empower students and viewers to think of themselves as makers of meaning is simply to get people to talk about artwork openly and to talk about images openly. So discussion and simply comment, what do you see? What do you see happening in that image? Like, what's going on in that picture? Just really basic questions allow people to incrementally build a sense of meaning for themselves of what they think the picture means to them, what resonance it carries for them. So discussion and simply asking viewers to describe what they're seeing, I feel like is a great gateway and is a great way of empowering people to immediately think of themselves as responsible for making meaning, for finding resonance. And that helps, I think, work against that notion, Sarita, that you're describing of the artwork as containing some kind of hidden truth, right? The artwork as a puzzle or a riddle, what we were talking about earlier, right? So it's a great question.
So we have a couple more minutes here. If there are any additional questions from the audience, please add them in the chat box here. Any kind of final thoughts from the two of you in regards to what we've discussed here today and how we make meaning from pictures and given all the visual images that we're surrounding ourselves with these days, and in particular with these two images?
Stacy, do you want to address Ilhan's question here? Ilhan has a question about captions.
Oh, I apologize.
No worries. No worries. I'm happy to offer final thoughts as well. But
yeah, sure. Let's address Ilhan's question, and then if you would offer some final thoughts. So the New Yorker magazine has captioned this cartoon section for its readers every week. Would you consider asking your students to caption these images with a song title? Which is a great question.
Ilhan, that's we're talking a lot about music today, I guess. I don't know. To me, maybe these two images don't quite lend themselves, or their gravity doesn't lend itself particularly well to song titles. But I certainly think the exercise of having students or viewers caption things is a really useful one. In galleries and museum spaces, we think, of course, a lot about captioning. And it's something that's often meticulously researched and thought through. And a lot can be revealed in that and in that struggle to give a picture a caption. And, I would point to the Turnley again. As I mentioned earlier, when this photograph was published in Harper's in 2004, it was simply captioned, "A relative at the wake of Staff Sergeant Patterson." And that's a very general description that leaves a lot out, right? And the gallery at Lehigh had given the photograph a different caption, the one that you see on the screen right now, to try to put a finer point on it. in that gap between those two captions, the published Harper's caption and this one, I think we're seeing a lot of what can come out of captioning, or the exercise of thinking about captions more rigorously.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it really speaks to the power of captions. I mean, this is something that a number of different, theorists of visual culture have written about. Perhaps most famously, certainly Benjamin talks about this, and of course Roland Barthes talks about this in his essay, The Rhetoric of the Image. That excuse me, that when we caption something, we really root the image, right? We really ground it, and we direct its meaning in such a way. And I think that the lack of a caption in some ways leaves it more malleable, right? Leaves it more open to the possibility of different stories it can tell. When we, so no, I probably wouldn't do that with this assignment, with these images, but I've certainly done that with images. I mean, I often do that with an assignment where I'll give students a very potent image. I like to work with one of the most potent images, I would argue, is the image of the sort of mother and child, right? That I think is, so iconic in the history of Western art, and ask them to caption that, and then ask them to recaption it as they find out more about the image, demonstrating both the malleability and the power of that image.
Yeah, in the museum context, I guess one of the things that we try to do with captions is to toe the line between being overly detailed and being also broad enough to allow for that malleability, Michael, that you're talking about, right? So, in some sense, for me at least, the ideal caption gives us just enough detail to ground us, but not so much that we can't find space in the image for ourselves. So captions.
Stacy, my sense is that we should be wrapping up, and I wonder if I could go off script and ask Nick one last question.
Of course you can. Yes.
Well, this is off script, so if Nick, if you want to punt or throw it right back at me, that's totally fine.
Yeah.
But I wondered if we could end, as we've been talking about pictures and stories today, I wondered if we could end by me asking you to sort of recall your favorite story of Ricardo, and share that with people here tonight.
Oh gosh. Oh boy. That's a great, I love that idea. And we started in some sense, right, with remembering Ricardo's passing, and it's wonderful that we can close on it. I've been at Lehigh for 11 years. I knew Ricardo for the whole of that time through his retirement. I would just sort of point to my sort of earliest meeting with him at my first department meeting in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Design in 2009 when I came to Lehigh. And those of you who remember and knew Ricardo know that he has a warmth and gregariousness about him, that he had that in him. It just sort of envelops you when you're near him. And he came up to me and said, welcome, those moments really resonate, or that energy and generosity of spirit that he had, that warmth, is the thing I think that I will remember best about him and about our time together. How about you, Michael?
And I think there's two stories that I think about. One, the first time I met him was in the gallery, and he brought me down to the bowels of the gallery and was showing me some of the photographs that he had in storage down in the basement. And was one of them that he had on site was a photograph from a 19th century British photograph that I was writing about the photographer, and he was sort of so generous in terms of letting me look at it, letting me put on gloves and handle it and touch it and pick it up. And I had never touched a 19th century photograph so close before. And I had never, I just remember thinking of the generosity of somebody who did not know me, who that was my first encounter with him, and he was showing me these photographs and so eager to do it. The second story really speaks to the gregariousness, I think, that you're mentioning. We were taking a job candidate out to dinner. I was with Ricardo and others, and it was at the end of the meal, and the server came by to ask if anybody wanted dessert or coffee. And I'm not going to remember Ricardo's exact words, but somebody had ordered a macchiato, and Ricardo had requested if he could, he said a macchiato would be great, but what he really would like, and it was the Cuban version of a macchiato. And I'm not going to remember what that was. And of course, the server didn't know how to make that. And Ricardo was trying to give some, as Ricardo was, of course, professional chef, and he was trying to offer some instruction on how to do that. And the server was trying, kindly trying to take notes. And Ricardo was so wonderfully generous and loving. And he offered to sort of help her make it. And the server, was like, yeah, great. And so Ricardo got up and went to the espresso machine and was helping her to make this drink. And the manager of the restaurant came over and was so eager to learn from Ricardo about this Cuban macchiato that Ricardo was designing and making. And I remember thinking, like, this guy owns the room. He owns the restaurant. Ricardo was that kind of person who could just take over the room, take over the restaurant, and people loved it. So I've been thinking about him a lot the past week, and really glad we could talk about him tonight.
That's great. That's a great story. And thank you, Michael, for this conversation. Thank you to all of you who've joined us here tonight for taking part, and to the gallery for organizing this. See you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and join us soon for our upcoming programs, and visit our website for lots of great resources and opportunities to explore our digital collection through ArtStore. Have a nice evening. Thank you, Michael and Nicholas. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Stacey.
Thank you.